are very delighted to have him here in Melbourne, Professor David Nutt, and I have to tell you a little about him because his biography is incredible, as I'm sure a lot of you know. But David is currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology. That word I always think is a little like supercalifragilistic. And he's the director of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit in the Division of Brain Sciences, Department of Medicine, Hammersmith Hospital at Imperial College in London. Quite a mouthful. He's currently Chair of Drug Science and President of the European Brain Council. Professor Nutt has published over 500 original research papers, a similar number of reviews and book chapters, 8 government reports on drugs, and 34 books. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Goes on. His book, Drugs Without the Hot Air, won the Transmission Prize for Communicating Science in 2014. He's in demand globally for his work on therapeutic as well as illicit drugs, their harms and their classification. He also lectures widely to the public and to the scientific and medical communities. The Times Eureka Science magazine included him in the 100 most important people in British science and the only psychiatrist on the list. Please welcome Professor David Nutt.
I should say that the reason I've done so much is I'm very old. It's my last visit to Melbourne. Well, it's been great to see you all. So, I'll just kick off by reminding you all that psychedelics have been around for a long time. If you go clockwise to the top left, that's peyote, the mushroom, there's some magic mushroom, the cactus, and some magic mushrooms. Then on the right, you've got ayahuasca being brewed up in the Amazon, and then you've got Amanita muscaris, morning glory seeds. The most important image on this slide is the bottom left-hand corner. There you see a 3,000-year-old Greek vase, and you see a Greek noble person partaking of a cocktail of ergot. You can see ergot on the right, and then to the right of it. That's a fungus which makes a psychedelic a product not dissimilar to psilocybin. And wine. And the Greeks had realized that the best time to have the holidays was when the dew began to collect on the cereals the ergot would grow, and then they retreat into the fields and have cocktails of alcohol and ergot, which gave them great experiences. They called them the Eleusinian mysteries. They cleansed their minds. They gave them insights into life. And after a couple of weeks of doing that, they went back to the city-states and did what the Greeks were rather good at doing, like invent democracy and write plays we still produce today. And it's interesting that psychedelics have been a feature of most, certainly many, human cultures. And we have been, until recently, one of the few cultures that have tried to exclude them from our experience. And it's good to see that that is beginning to change, and today is an example of that in Australia. The real breakthrough, though, in terms of the science of psychedelics came with this man, Albert Hofmann, who decided to try to adapt ergot, which has been known for centuries as a treatment for migraines and for bleeding after childbirth. He decided to modify it to see if he could produce a more effective agent. And he made a number of compounds, and of course the one that lasted is this one, LSD-25. And that proved to be a revolution in terms of our understanding the brain. He was the first person to try it accidentally and discovered it had very profound effects on his consciousness. And he realized he discovered something very important, and persuaded the company he worked for, Sandoz, to make it available as both a medicine and as an experimental tool back in 1953. In those days it was legal, and a number of very important scientists tried LSD, and these are the two most important Nobel Prizes in medicine. On the left, Francis Crick, who with Watson worked out the structure of DNA as a double helix. And on the right, Carey Mullis. And Carey was an American biochemist who was trying to work out how we could get enough DNA to find out whether it was different in different species and in different cells. And he was struggling with that challenge until one day he said, I was during an LSD trip, I saw the molecule of DNA, the double helix, unraveling itself in front of me as a series of serpents. And he realized that that's what he had to do. He had to work out a way of replicating DNA. So he hunted around, he found an enzyme called the polymerase enzyme, and then he invented a reaction called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, which underpins all life sciences today. It underpins a lot of food sciences. So if you're not sure whether you're having a hamburger or a kangaroo burger, you PCR it and you find out. Francis Crick was a remarkable man. He got the Nobel Prize for his discovery, as I've said, and then he helped Sanger get a Nobel Prize for working out how RNA made DNA. And then, having sorted out the nature of life, he wondered what to do with the rest of his life. And, having taken LSD, he came to the conclusion that actually life was easy, but the mind was difficult. Unfortunately, soon after Crick started using LSD, it was made illegal. And his parties in Cambridge were rather notorious. And one day the police came round to his house, which was quite easy to find because he stuck a golden helix outside. He said, Professor Crick, you've got to stop because it's now illegal. And he did what any self-respecting, independent thinking scientist would do. He said, well, stuff you, and he went to America. And he never came back. And we lost our greatest scientist in Newton to a change in the law. The point I share this with you because these two men were using LSD when it was legal, and both said it had a major influence on their life. Mullis said he would never have got the Nobel Prize if it hadn't been for seeing under an LSD trip how to decode DNA. I rather like this quote from Einstein, which I think sums up their approach to life. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think what we're learning now, as we work more and more with these drugs, is that may well be true for psychological problems. Maybe we need to change our minds so that we can think through our problems in a different way to the way they were created. And psychedelics may give us the opportunity to do that. Now, the psychiatric profession were very enamored with LSD when it was first made available. Here you see a picture of it as a medicine. It was called Delicid. It was supplied in ampules by Sandoz. And it was used in a number of different ways. It was used to model psychosis, and we still do that today. We still use now magic mushrooms to make people have strange experiences, which we can then try to treat with innovative new possible antipsychotics. It was used by mental health professionals, usually by the young psychiatrists were told that the next day they were going to be given LSD, so they'd understand what it was like to be mad. And many of them found it a very interesting and powerful experience. And then it was used in therapy. It was used in two sorts of therapy. It's what was called psychedelic psychotherapy, which was largely used in the USA, and which is really what we're doing today, where you give someone a relatively high dose, they have a powerful trip, and from that, out of that, comes a change in the way they view the world, and associated often with these mystical and peak experiences you heard Melissa talk about. And then there was also psycholytic psychotherapy, which is a bit more akin to what people now think of as microdosing, where you use low doses in a regular way to help people's brains become more susceptible to the kinds of psychotherapy that the therapist is doing. And there was no question LSD was a great breakthrough in terms of understanding the human brain in the 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of psychiatrists worldwide worked with it. The US government funded over 130 grants to research it. Those resulted in 1,000 clinical papers, which included 40,000 patients. There were 40 books, 6 international conferences, and the results were overwhelmingly positive, describing safe and effective treatment. And if you look at some of the detailed analyses that were done, going back in the 60s, looking back to many different case series, you can see that the effects were, by and large, really rather good. And here's a summary of it. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions. Some people get anxious, some people have bad trips. But given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not. Overall, the outcomes were remarkably impressive and safe. And Stanislav Grof, who carried on using his work in an underground therapist after the drugs were made illegal, said this, which I certainly fully endorse, and I guess many in the room will endorse. Psychedelics, used responsibly and with proper caution, would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. So the real question is, why don't we use them? And to understand that, we have to go back into the history of the Vietnam War. And the reality was, the Vietnam War was a war that was being lost. Young American men were discovering that they were being sent out arbitrarily to fight in this place which they'd never heard of, to fight people they would never see. A bit like Afghanistan in Iraq, but anyway. And they were reading, his feedback from soldiers there. Ron Kovic, who you've probably seen the film, was paralyzed as a result of fighting there. And Kovic said, all I could feel was the worthlessness of right here in this place and in this moment, all for nothing. And Michael O'Brien said, I didn't want to die, not ever, but certainly not then, not in the wrong war. The war in Vietnam was being lost. Young men were refusing to fight. But what was worse was they were going to San Francisco and they were taking LSD. They were reading the works of this man, Timothy Leary. They were turning on and dropping out. But that was okay, but the big problem was when they started to protest. And the right-hand image, I think, is the key one. Because people, after having taken LSD, decided that they generally didn't want to fight. They wanted to love. And they began to fuel the campaign against the war. And that statement there, drop acid, not bombs, I think is an extraordinarily profound statement. And I have to, as a European who's seen Europe falling apart as a result of the Syrian war and 6 million refugees undermining the stability of Europe, I kind of feel that dropping acid in Syria would have been a lot more sensible. But what's even more remarkable about LSD was that it got banned in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in the world at the time. There's Bobby Kennedy. He would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. And his bureaucrats are telling him, we've got to ban LSD. And he's saying, well, hang on, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because a few months ago it was the great cure for mental illness. And now you're telling me we've got to ban it. If those projects were worthwhile 6 months ago, why aren't they worthwhile? You keep going round and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. But even he could not stop the bureaucrats filling in the box that said LSD had no medical use and should be made illegal. And all the other psychedelics were then shoveled into the box. And I would argue that's the worst censorship of research and medical treatment in the history of humanity. I don't believe there's anything that comes remotely close. The nearest you can get to a similar worldwide ban on research was in 1616 when the Catholic Church banned the telescope. They didn't like the fact that Copernicus had worked out that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And the banning of psychedelics was for the same reason. They were challenging the hegemony of the establishment. They were challenging the belief systems. And so they had to be banned. The banning of the telescope lasted 150 years. The banning of psychedelics has lasted 50 years. And it's still ongoing. Banning of the telescope was only relevant in Catholic countries. The Protestant Northern Europeans could carry on looking at the skies. The banning of psychedelics has been endorsed by every single one of the 197 countries who signed the UN Convention. And this is what happened to research as a result of that banning. So this graph shows year on year the number of published papers which contain either LSD in blue or psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, in red. And you can see, as Hoffman predicted, LSD was going to transform our understanding of the brain. The more studies were done, the more papers were published. You can see there was this massive increase in outputs. So the red arrow was when it was banned. And then for a couple of years, people still got published because work had been done. And it had to be written up. But then there was this precipitous fall because since that red arrow, there's not been a single grant funded, I don't believe, anywhere in the world to study LSD, certainly not in America where most of this research is done. So you can see that the failure to fund and the resistance of the authorities to make available this drug for research meant it almost disappeared from the research arena. As it's been psilocybin for 2 years, 90 and 91, there was not a single publication in the whole world. If you're interested in it, you can read a couple of papers I've written that go into it in some detail, expose the full horror of this censorship. But about 10 years, maybe 13 years ago now, we decided it was time to find out what these drugs did in the brain. One of my claims to fame is I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human beings than anyone else alive. Taken many of them myself. We hadn't done psychedelics, so we decided we would study psychedelics because someone had to. And the psychedelics we worked on are drugs which are shown on here, like LSD, psilocybin, and others like DMT. All these drugs work by binding to a receptor in the brain, a serotonin or 5-HT receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor. And the greater the affinity they have for this receptor, the greater the potency. And we started off using psilocybin, magic mushrooms. There's one form of magic mushrooms, the Liberty Cap. But we started this work, it was getting psilocybin was so expensive, we could only give it intravenously because that reduces the dose tenfold. So we give it intravenously. Now it's that we can give it orally, we can afford to give it orally. Why do we use psilocybin? Well, it's relatively short acting, especially if you use it intravenously. It's extremely safe. 1 million British people use it every year and there's never been a death. And the other great thing about it is that no politician or journalist knows how to spell it. So but I'm very interested in serotonin receptors. I've worked on them all my life. And the receptors that psilocybin targets are shown here. You see that the red is the highest density of these receptors, blue is low density. And the highest densities are in the most evolutionary recent parts of the brain. Human beings have more of these receptors than any other species, and the more evolved parts of your brain have more of these receptors than the less evolved parts. They've got something fundamentally to do with why humans are and how they think and why our brains are so effective. And these drugs, psilocybin and LSD, they all stimulate these receptors. So we did the first study. We put people into a scanner, we gave them psilocybin, and we expected to see that their brains were turned on, because that's what everyone said psychedelics do, they turn on. But in fact they didn't. Here you see these are brain scans showing brain activity. Blue means less activity. And after psilocybin, a few areas of the brain were switched off, but no area was switched on. And that was such a surprise to us, we thought, oh, this must be wrong. So we repeated the whole experiment using a different kind of fMRI imaging, but got exactly the same results. And then we started thinking, well, what is going on here? And it came to us that actually the areas of the brain which are being switched off probably do have a particular role in maintaining brain function, and it's the switching off of those which allows the psychedelic experience. Because those regions of the brain are what have been called connector hubs. These are the the circuits of the brain which integrate brain function. The one at the front, at the top, as you can see, the top of the two yellow circles integrates your emotions with your memories and with your attention and your thinking. And on the back, the posterior cingulate cortex integrates your hearing, your seeing, your vision, your sense of balance, etc. These are the control centers of the brain. They're like the conductors of the orchestra. And it came to us that what is happening with psychedelics is you're switching those regions off, and then the rest of the brain is doing its own thing. It's a bit like if you take away the conductor of an orchestra, then the orchestra will stop playing Mozart and might well end up playing jazz. And, in fact, we believe that that's exactly what happens. That under psychedelics, your brain is liberated to do things which has been constrained from doing over the decades in which you have been brought up and educated to be what you are. And here's another way of looking at that uncoupling of control centers. What you see here is a series of images looking at the brain from different perspectives. And the hotter regions are at the top image are an area of the brain, or a network of the brain we call the default mode networks. That's the network of the brain which defines your sense of self. And it comprises those two control centers. They work in unison. And under psychedelics, you'll see at the bottom images that the interaction between those front and back regions disappears. And that's this uncoupling of the default mode is why people have a very profound altered sense of self, because that is where your sense of self is. And you've already seen this image, and I'll show it again. So this is an analysis made by some mathematicians. Each of those two circles contains 7,200 connections. And they're connections which are based on the likelihood of any particular brain region firing at the same time as any other. On the left-hand side of the normal brain, you see most of the connections are around the edge. And what that really tells us is that the brain can become very efficient at doing what it does. Areas of the brain which do the same thing, talk to each other. There are a few connections across the brain. Obviously, you've got to integrate what you see and you hear, but they're not a lot. That's called the small world brain. The brain is basically talking to itself in local areas, local regions. But under psilocybin, and the same is true under LSD, there are a lot more connections across the brain. And it's this massive increase in connectivity across the brain, because you've taken away the control centers, that allows people to begin to think differently. The only time your brain was as communicable as under psilocybin is when you were a child. And one perspective of education is it actually eventually breaks down all those connections and forces the brain to work in its very limited, regular way, which is useful in some ways. It helps you speak the language that everyone else speaks and read maps in the same way as everyone else, but it may also, in some cases, like depression and obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction, become so constrained that you can't break out when you have maladaptive thinking or behavior. We did the first ever LSD imaging study in the brain as well, and showed exactly the same thing. Psilocybin, LSD, they disrupt this network of self in the brain profoundly. And this is an image that we're very proud of. This is an image which explains why people have profound and complex visual images when their eyes are shut under psychedelics. Because on the left-hand side, you see that under placebo, the normal state of the brain is that the visual cortex has a lit up bit at the back. Mostly just speaks to itself. It doesn't bother to communicate with the rest of the brain because it actually doesn't think the rest of the brain deserves to get any kind of interaction. But under LSD, the connections are everywhere, and people can then see and feel and think in a very much broader and different fashion. The mind is truly opened in a way that hasn't been, as I said, since the original. But one of the other things we discovered in this work was that even when you give people psychedelics in a brain scanner, they often feel better afterwards. And at the time we were aware of this work from John Hopkins, Roland Griffiths' group, showing that if you take middle-aged people who just want to see if there's anything better in life, then 25 milligrams of psilocybin, the same dose as we used in the scanner, can produce profound alterations in their sense of well-being, which were often enduring and often reported as being one of the 5 most significant experiences of their life. And we thought, well, maybe if our subjects are feeling better coming out of the scanner, and his subjects are not feeling they're just looking for something different. They were feeling, having well-being that was enduring. Maybe there's something in this story. Maybe we could actually use psilocybin to treat depression. And we wrote a grant, and it's the only grant we've ever gotten from any formal funding body to study psilocybin. We got it from the Medical Research Council. And it was to study resistant depression, and I think it was awarded because, as you've heard already, depression is an enormous problem. And current treatments are not very effective. And we were funded to see if psilocybin would be an improvement. Getting the grant was, however, the easy bit. It took 3 iterations of the ethics committee to get permission to do the study. And in the end, they refused to allow us to do a controlled trial. They said it was too dangerous. Psilocybin might kill people. So it's free, and never done it before, but depressed people, you never done it. So in the end, we had to do what's called a safety study. We had to give it to all the subjects in an open fashion. We had to monitor them all for 6 months. They said if none of them get seriously ill in 6 months, then you can do a control trial. But of course, they knew by that point all the money would have run out because that was a year. But it took actually 30 months, over 2.5 years to get the drug, because only one place in the world would make it to a standard that we could use. And then another 2 months to get the regulatory approval. So 32 months out of a 36 months grant was spent getting the drug. Why is that? Well, because it's an illegal drug and very dangerous, ho-ho. I had to get a special police check to be able to. I can say to the officers, well, look, I can sign a prescription for heroin, but you make me have a special police check to do research on psilocybin. Why is that? And he said, well, you could be selling it on the street. I'm saying at £1,500 a dose, not even in Chelsea. But anyway, we got through it, we did the study, and we did it initially in 12 subjects, expanded to 20. They were treatment-resistant major depression. They'd all failed on at least 2 drugs and all failed on CBT. Some had failed on dozens of drugs. We did a small test dose of psilocybin and the proper dose a week apart, and the results were really rather remarkable. You can see half the subjects' depression scores dropped down into the yellow band. The yellow band means they're not depressed anymore, in remission. So within a week of a single dose of a high dose of psilocybin, half the people who've been depressed for months or years were better. And the ones that didn't get it fully better got a bit better. And this is probably the most profound effect of any drug ever in the history of treating resistant depression. Remarkable. And you can see some people stayed well for months, and others, the depression began to creep back. And this is the current challenge for us now, to work out how we can sustain the improvement. We know we can get it, but can we sustain it? And it may be that several doses of psilocybin might end up giving a better outcome. But this was a very powerful and satisfying response. And it's based on this that the multi-center trial that the Compass Pathways are doing around Europe and the USA has been set up. Now, how does it work? Well, we're very interested in this. We can see it changes the brain, but as well as changing the brain, it changes people's beliefs and attitudes. And one of the interesting pieces of data we had was this questionnaire, which looks at pessimism and optimism. And you see the green bar. The green bar is the score of our depressed patients before the treatment. And they have what's called a pessimism bias, which means that they see the world as a nasty, hostile, unpleasant place. Actually, they're right, but that doesn't help. Description from one of our patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. And most of our patients describe something like this. They describe in depression being locked into a mindset which they didn't like, but they couldn't escape from. And they describe psilocybin as disrupting that, as some of them said, defragging the hard drive, others said erasing or reformatting their mind so that they could think more clearly. And I believe that's what it's doing. It's disrupting the brain processes which drive depression so people can escape from it. There are other psilocybins going on. There was a small OCD study before, the studies in alcoholism, tobacco dependence, end-of-life anxiety, prevention, and now this big multi-center trial from Compass Pathways. And in fact, it turns out positive, then I think psilocybin will have a license for the treatment of depression within 5 years. Certainly in Europe. And this emphasizes what Peter said before. They've been given breakthrough therapy designation, which means that the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, see them, this psilocybin and also MDMA, as being very significant advances, not just incremental developments in terms of traditional antidepressants, but actually breaking through into a new kind of therapy, which might have very powerful implications. And they want to expedite research and treatment for that. And here is a quite great quote to finish on. This is a quote from the writer and philosopher George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And I hope that our research will help people change their minds about the value of psychedelics. I mean, I started this research primarily wanting to understand what the psychedelic experience was about and how it was causing the brain. From that came insights which allowed us to go and study it in depression. The results have been powerful, and now we are continuing this research both in depression and also areas like OCD and anorexia and addiction, because hopefully it can help our patients change their minds and break out of the terrible entrapments that these disorders impose upon their minds and behaviour. So it's time now to speak out about this. So this is a quote from Aldous Huxley, the man who published, I suppose it's publicised, made available the first genuinely publicly accessible commentary on the psychedelic experience in his book, The Doors of Perception, after having taken mescaline and subsequently LSD. And this is how governments have tried to stop this research, and they've been pretty successful, actually. You know, it's over 50 years, very few people have been able to do it, there's no funding. And Huxley pointed out that great is truth, but still greater from a practical point of view is silence about truth. By simply not mentioning certain subjects, totalitarian propagandists have influenced opinion much more effectively than they could have by the most eloquent denunciations. And that's why it's so great to see so many people here thinking about psychedelics, because I'm certain that when you leave, you'll be talking about them. And the greater the conversation, the more difficult it will be for the people who don't want to admit the value of these treatments to resist it. So please share this quote, share the experiences and the learnings of tonight with your friends, your family, and most of all, with enlightened politicians. Thank you.